got a panel, including myself, but also other guests I'm delighted to welcome here. The panel is on the topic of political realignment, a very topical issue, you might say. This is an idea which I myself first formulated about a dozen years ago or more, but which has now become part of everyday journalistic and political conversation. And it's the idea that there's some kind of big fundamental shift going on in voting patterns and the nature of politics. And so without further ado, let me introduce my co-panelists. So we have the following. Lisi Christopherson is the head of research and strategy in London for CT Group. She's worked at what you might call the coalface of politics for quite a few years. Kate Andrews, former colleague of mine at the IEA, is currently the economics correspondent for the Spectator and a widely interviewed commentator on politics, on both sides of the Atlantic. David Goodhart is the head of the demography unit at Policy Exchange. He's the author of two books relevant to this topic, The Road to Somewhere, and more recently, the book Head, Hand, Heart, The Struggle for the Dignity and Status in 21st Century Britain. Now, I recommend this most recent book very strongly, by the way. I'm a big fan of it. And of course, I myself am, as those of you who don't know me should know, the head of education at the IEA, Steve Davies. And I've also written a book on this topic, The Economics and Politics of Brexit, The Realignment of British Public Life. I'm going to ask each member of the panel to speak for 5 minutes. David, if you could start us off.
Thanks, Steve. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very loud and clear.
Yes, I guess like you, I've been someone who's been interested in this whole question of realignment for 10 or 15 years or so. In my case, I guess I was back in the late 90s, early 2000s, a sort of reasonably conventional sort of centre-left supporter of New Labour. And I sort of guess I kind of realigned myself in some ways, partly through my interest in immigration. I wrote a book in 2013 before the two you just mentioned called The British Dream. And I spent quite a lot of time in places that have been dramatically changed by immigration and came to see people's objections to very high and rapid immigration as completely legitimate and not, in most cases at least, a product of prejudice or bigotry. And so I became, I suppose, much more open to the sort of what is sometimes called the cultural turn in contemporary British and indeed more widely Western politics. I think it was the result of a kind of an accumulation of sort of barnacles on the bottom of the boat, as it were, of contemporary liberalism. The openness that was associated, the kind of free market openness and sort of social and cultural openness that was associated with the period of the kind of unipolar US domination, end of the Cold War, from the early 90s right through perhaps to the financial crash. There was a very strong consensus in most countries that somehow a kind of an answer had been found, and it was a pretty free market in economics. Not completely so. I mean, there was kind of New Labour caveats to free markets, much greater fondness for high public spending and somewhat more interventionist in markets, although not very much more. But a very much going with the sort of dominant consensus of what one might call the sort of liberal graduate class, or in my book Road to Somewhere, the group I described as the Anywheres, people who are essentially, in almost all cases, would be graduates. In our country, that means moving away from home, moving to residential universities, and often moving social class, joining a whole new group and acquiring a worldview that tended to prioritize mobility and openness and autonomy, tended to be rather sort of skeptical about traditional values, as it were, the kind of the less mobile, the somewhere people who place security and familiarity above openness and change. And I think these became the new dividing lines of politics to some extent, as we saw most vividly in the Brexit vote. But I think that this accumulation of protest, if you like, against some of the strands of contemporary liberalism, particularly perhaps its eagerness to embrace change, and its belief that change is somehow always good, whereas actually most human beings regard change as loss. There was I think a failure to sort of grasp some of the sort of fundamentals of human collective social psychology in that respect. I mean, of course, you might say the right's mistake in that area was to embrace too much of the creative destruction of the modern market economy, and perhaps in the case of the UK anyway, to be too blasé about rapid deindustrialization. I mean, if you compare deindustrialization in the UK and say Germany, you know, we went dramatically fast. If you compare industrial Yorkshire, say, with the Ruhrgebiet in Germany, it's a very different story. The mistake of the left was to be blasé about immigration and to say, well, you know, why does it matter if we have another 200,000 people from Romania or wherever, and not understanding how people can find that discomforting without being prejudiced or bigoted. So I think there are all sorts of other sort of accumulated discontents, particularly the one I focused on in my last book, Head, Hand, Heart, which is to do with the kind of narrowing of what it is to be, of what is regarded as a successful life in our societies. The too much emphasis on one form of human aptitude, one form of human skill, one form of human intelligence, that to do with kind of pattern recognition, exam passing, analytical intelligence, cognitive analytical intelligence. Much more than was the case 50 or 60 years ago. There came to be one ladder to a successful life, and that was passing exams, going to a good university, and acquiring a cognitive professional career. And many people either can't or don't want to take that route. And I think a lot of people felt that their contribution in other areas of life was had become devalued. And I think, again, we saw that manifested, I think, in the Brexit vote. I think we've also seen it manifested in I think there's been rather a welcome shift in the right direction, actually, as a result of the pandemic, but perhaps we can come on that later. So essentially what's happened in politics, I think, is that the cultural shift has taken place. And underlining that, I think, is what I and other people talked about, the kind of missing middle in politics. The missing middle was always, for the last 20 or 30 years in any case, has been the sort of sweet spot, actually, of public opinion, which is somewhat to the left economically, by which I don't mean sort of Corbyn economics. I mean sort of pro-market social democracy, if you like, in economics, and somewhat more conservative with a small c in cultural matters. And that combination has never really been expressed. I mean, for all sorts of contingent and historical reasons across Europe. That's my final point, Steve. For all sorts of reasons, I mean, most centre-left parties went off in a very culturally sort of libertarian, permissive direction in the 60s, 70s, and never really came back. And indeed have kind of doubled down on it in some ways through the embrace of so-called wokeness in recent times. The centre-right parties obviously went very free market in the 80s, 90s, and have to some extent recoiled from that or retreated from that, but possibly to the dismay of the IEA. And I think one adage sort of sums up recent politics in Britain, which is that it's easier for the right to move a little bit to the left on economics than it is for the left to move right on culture. And I think
I'll
that
just be there then, David. Thanks
okay.
very much for that. That's okay. Thanks for that, David. And Kate, if you could speak now.
Thanks so much, Steve. I went back and listened to one of the first podcasts that we did for Live for North Street, the IEA's podcast channel, when I was at the IEA, and you're being interviewed by our former colleague, Madeline Grant, about the politics of realignment. And more or less within a few years, much of it came true. And it was interesting thinking back on that, how we were seeing these signs long before the pandemic hit and what the pandemic coming means for political realignment now. It also made me wonder about your first podcast for the channel, Steve, about how we're all going to live to 700 years old. Bodes well for that theory. But we'll talk about that another time. I suppose what we have seen, even before the pandemic, is rising populism, parties on the left dominated by identity politics, parties on the right seeking more interventionism. But it seems that the pandemic has accelerated much of this change. And I guess the two areas that I'll speak to in my brief opening remarks are the economic changes and also some language changes, which I've noticed. We've been seeing the abandonment of fiscal responsibility in policy on the right before the pandemic hit, often not completely. Normally, half of the policy would be somewhat liberally minded, keeping taxes relatively low, for example. You can look to the Donald Trump tax cuts in 2017. You can look to Boris Johnson's pledge in 2019 not to touch income tax, VAT, etc. But they were all willing to borrow more money to avoid making the difficult trade-offs and decisions. So the Trump tax cuts were never actually paid for. The March budget back in 2020 added $30 billion extra to the books, the majority of which was not COVID related at the time. They were planning on spending a lot more money on infrastructure and healthcare and the rest before the pandemic before we knew just how serious and expensive it was going to be. So now we can flash forward 15 months and major economies have turned on the printing machine. I imagine they're all sitting there at the G7 in Cornwall this week and looking at Japan saying, gosh, this QE stuff is great. We totally get what you were doing before. It is just unlimited money, and fiscal responsibility is out the window. And you can tell now in the US and the UK that a lot of people in traditionally conservative groups, right-wing blocs, are absolutely delighted to see it go. They're calling for all kinds of spending. They're opposed to major tax cuts. You're seeing that play out this week with the foreign aid debate within the Conservative Party. If they were given a vote, there are potentially enough rebels there to stop the government from cutting foreign aid from 0.7% to 0.5% because they just don't want to talk about where money is going and how it's being spent. And in normal times, had this progressed more organically, I think you would have seen the emergence of a new bloc, albeit much smaller and probably not competitive for some time, of people who would have stood up to this and made the arguments for classical liberalism from an economic perspective. But right now, because it's moved so fast, they are absolutely nowhere in sight. And the most conservative you get are in the States, people like Rand Paul, who, to be fair, is very fiscally minded. And in the UK, Rishi Sunak, who is willing to talk to his own party about trying to address balancing the books at some point in the future, acknowledging that if interest rates go up by even 1%, the country could be in a very difficult position having to pay its bills. And he's the chancellor, so that's good news for us. But if that is the most conservative that you're getting now, you can tell the extent to which things have really changed. And I think the language has changed too. So I was speaking about, how they kind of got it half right before the pandemic hit. And Boris Johnson loved to talk about free markets and free people and how this is how you pay for the public services that you wanted to bring in. But now that language has been abandoned. We are far less risk oriented. We are nervous about taking risks for all sorts of reasons. But we're also much more comfortable with spending money to, I suppose, in our minds, having to avoid the risk. I'm not sure that is actually possible. And we're not talking anymore about what the market can do and what private companies can do. We're talking about what the state can do. And that brings me on to my last point, which I suppose is if we're going to talk about realignment, we should also talk about the politics of desperation. And what I mean by that is across Europe and the West, big economies now find themselves in an extremely precarious position. And I'm not forecasting that they're all going to collapse anytime soon. Who knows what it would take? It may be that we have to have several more crises for this to really come to a head. It may be that Biden's spending packages in the US really do create an inflation spike, and we have to deal with that. But at some point, things are going to turn south. We just don't know to what extent.
Oh, hello, Kate's frozen there. So.
Am I back?
It's a Chinese
Yes, right.
cyber attack. It's a cyber attack from the Chinese.
Oh, I'm back. Am I back, Steve?
Yes, you are. Yes, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, well, it's funny you say that. I'll wrap up now. But what I was going to say is, I think in this politics of desperation, you're going to find that China becomes that division point in a way that perhaps it would not have several years ago, because countries that are desperate for money, countries that are worried about their finances, may well be looking to countries like China to provide some of that relief. I'm thinking of Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline that's already causing a lot of instability between Western countries as to how we deal with that. You have Emmanuel Macron talking about how France is going to come up with its own China policy, perhaps, rather than going through more international channels. And I think that the political realignment that we've been witnessing on domestic fronts may well now start to become international, as allies who normally would be in the exact same positions on these things, as they look at their own situation now, their own finances, and the shaky nature of them, and may be more or less willing to cozy up to countries that are becoming increasingly problematic as they try to sort out their own finances. So on that point, I'll hand it back over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. And yeah, an interesting thought there, I think. Lisi, if you could tell us your thoughts now.
Of course. To everyone listening, hi, I'm Lisi. I'm head of research at Sir Linton Crosby's firm, CT Group. I ran the Conservatives research program during the 2019 general election campaign, and I've also had the privilege of working on the 2017 and 2015 general elections. So as you can probably imagine, I've spent a lot of time up north listening to voters recently, and it's really given me this amazing experience of being able to witness firsthand this shifting psyche of voters. So today I was thinking about what I was going to talk about, and I decided that I'd share a few reflections on a seat that's very close to my heart and is what I feel emblematic, really, of the political realignment that we're discussing, and that is the constituency of Scunthorpe. So Scunthorpe is an industrial town in the northeast, as many of you probably know. It's got a working population whose income is below the national average. Its population is less educated, more white, and less diverse than the country as a whole. And it had been a Labour safe seat since its inception in 1997. And it was really considered this bastion of the Red Wall, and its demographics that I just covered were really illustrative of the Labour heartland at the time. My first trip to Scunthorpe was in 2017. 2 days before the 2017 general election, I was sat in the back room of a pub conducting a focus group to try and figure out if voters were actually going to turn out and vote for Theresa May and the Conservatives. The recruit that I was speaking to were Labour leavers. So most of the people sitting around the table with me were lifelong Labour voters who had voted for Brexit in 2016. And most of these voters were still struggling with their decision. I made a couple of observations from that night, 2 days before the election. Number one, Brexit was the most important issue, and voters wanted to send a strong negotiator to the Brexit table. The second observation I made was that these Labour voters saw Corbyn as weak on Brexit. They saw him as providing weak leadership in general, and they also had started to question how he was going to fund his manifesto promises. But the third thing that I observed was that these voters still weren't sold on the Conservatives. They had serious concerns about what another 5 years of the Tories would mean for things like social issues that they really cared about, the NHS, especially social care at the time. And what became clear to me sitting in the back room of that pub 2 days before the general election in Scunthorpe was that these voters were still worried on a deeply emotive level about voting for what they still viewed as the nasty party. Demonstrably, they were ready and willing to realign themselves on the biggest issue of the day, which was Brexit, but they still had these niggling fears about the Conservative Party ideology. 2 days later, what happened at the election? I'm sure some of you political nuts will know that Scunthorpe voted to return their local Labour MP, Nick Dakin, who not only held on to his seat, but actually increased his vote share by 10 percentage points. So fast forward to 2019, it's a few months before the election, and I am literally back at the same pub in Scunthorpe, and I'm sitting around the same table with a group of Labour leavers asking how they felt about the upcoming general election. And there were similarities, right? They still wanted to get Brexit done. They still thought that Corbyn was really weak on Brexit, really weak in general, and they still questioned how he was going to fund his manifesto promises. But there had also been this palpable emotive shift in the way these voters considered their choice. And the only way that I can describe it to you is that they were pissed. They were pissed because politicians hadn't respected the democratic will of the majority, and Brexit still hadn't happened. And it had left these voters feeling so disenfranchised, completely disillusioned with the political class, and really, really angry. And I'm just going to read you a couple of sentences from what I wrote at the time. These voters are furious by Parliament's handling of Brexit, believing that politicians have sold them out. It's the first time that many of these lifelong Labour supporters have considered a vote for the Conservatives. They view Boris as the only leader who seems interested and capable of grasping Brexit by the scruff of the neck to deliver the democratic vote. All of them are hoping that the election results in a majority government. The absence of a majority, they believe, has not only paralysed the country, but also allowed Parliament to manipulate the government by seizing control of the legislative agenda. Should the election result in a hung Parliament, they dread further Brexit and economic uncertainty at the expense of important issues like health, immigration, and education. So what happened in December 2019? Scunthorpe voted for its first Conservative MP since its inception by 54% to 37%. It wasn't just a Conservative victory, though. It was a massive Labour defeat because Labour's vote share fell by 15% in Scunthorpe at that election. And as we all know, Boris won this historic parliamentary majority by flipping seats just like Scunthorpe in the Red Wall to the Conservatives. So just to finish off, to bring this full circle, what can Scunthorpe tell us about why there's been this realignment? Number one, Brexit undoubtedly has played a really large role. The Conservatives were the only party promising to get Brexit done, to break the deadlock and move the country forward. Number two, Corbyn. Even lifelong Labour voters in the 2019 election saw him as too weak to be Prime Minister. He didn't have a clear position on Brexit that really bothered these voters. And he was facing massive credibility issues. Even Labour voters, again, were saying nothing comes for free. After what they'd heard in 2015 about the long-term economic plan, these voters are actually now frequently questioning how free policies are going to be paid for in Labour's manifesto. And the third thing, Boris Johnson managed to appeal to the working class voters that he needed to appeal to. They were so tired of the political class when I spoke to them in 2019. They strongly associated this political class with the gridlock that they'd faced in Parliament, with broken promises. They just didn't feel like they were being represented by their politicians. And instead, they wanted someone who was authentic and who could get stuff done. And Boris was that authentic person. This Eton and Oxford educated former editor of The Standard was the only one that those voters saw that was fighting to make good on his promise to deliver the democratic vote. So where does the realignment go in the future? There's been a lot of talk about levelling up. There's been a lot of talk about the economic recovery, but I really expect that the longevity of the realignment is going to hinge on whether the Prime Minister can continue to prove that he's a servant of the people and whether he can keep delivering what they want to see.
Thanks for that, Lisi. Okay, well, just put my own little card to the table here. As I said, I have thought that we were on the verge of a realignment from about 12 years ago, and I formulated what you might call a prophecy then that since has become an analysis. And what led me to first start thinking this was that I observed the coming apart of the coalition that Ronald Reagan had put together in the United States in the 1970s, which had led him to victory in 1980, one which combined traditional conservatives, religious evangelicals, and free market libertarians. Fusionism, as it was called at an intellectual level, and it was put together by people like Bill Buckley back in the 60s. And what I noticed was that basically this kind of marriage of convenience, as I think it always was, between libertarians and conservatives was basically heading towards a rather acrimonious divorce, which we've since seen happen. And I then became more interested in this, and I would argue that actually the realignment we're seeing at the moment is the 9th such realignment in the history of British politics. That, in fact, realignments are a periodic feature of British politics. The first really big one took place all the way back between 1715 and 1723. And we had one in the 1960s and 70s. We had a very big realignment in the 1920s with the collapse of the old Liberal Party as a major force and the rise of the Labour Party and organised labour. And what happens, I think, in a realignment is that the fundamental issue that divides society and around which politics is organised, the aligning issue, changes. And for the last, since the early 1970s through until very recently, the major aligning issue was whether or not you were in favour of free markets or state control of the economy. And there was a secondary aligning issue over whether or not you were socially liberal, a John Stuart Mill type, if you will, or whether you were a social conservative and authoritarian, a Peter Hitchens type, if you like. And that produced broadly two dominant blocks, if you like. People who combined free market economics with cultural and social conservatism and authoritarianism, and people who combined social liberalism with left of centre views and economics. And that left two blocks of voters up for grabs, the consistent libertarians and the consistent authoritarians. Now, what I think has happened now is that although the economic issue is still hugely important, as the remarks you just heard from all of our panelists have indicated, it's become the secondary issue. The big issue now is often described as being values, and I think it's fundamentally the division that David identified. It's the division between cosmopolitans and localists, or if you like to put it more pejoratively, globalists and nationalists. Open and closed is another way it's often described, which I think is a rather loaded way of describing it. And I think that David captured what that is very clearly, and I think Lisi's account of what she found in Scunthorpe also shows how that plays out in a particular constituency in a particular place. But it could be just as well be Burnley or Bishop Auckland or Northwest Durham, any number of seats. And so we've changed, I think. We're seeing a change in the aligning issue. And this is going on in most developed democracies and quite a few less developed countries as well, by the way. In fact, it's easier to list the countries where this kind of change is not happening, which is basically the Irish Republic, Japan, Portugal, maybe Canada. Otherwise, it's happening everywhere. Now, it's taking a different form, though, in each individual country. And what we've seen here is a transformation of the two parties, which is almost complete on one side, but not yet on the other. And the Conservative Party, I think, as I argue in my book, is a bit like Doctor Who. One of the reasons why it is the most long-lived and successful party of its kind anywhere in the world is that periodically it suddenly undergoes a strange regeneration in which its voting base undergoes a major change, its appearance changes, things it believes in appears to change, the policies change. But this is always done with one goal in mind, which is to A, win elections and be in power, and B, and therefore keep the other lot out, and B, also to make sure that there is only one party on that side of British politics, the side that looks to maintain the status quo, broadly speaking, albeit perhaps with reforms. And so I think that actually Brexit was not what caused this, it was a product of a realignment in the electorate, which the British Conservative Party recognised and decided to put itself on one side of. Now, what that means, I think, is that the side it's identified with in Britain, which is the side that combines broadly slightly left of centre view in economics with more nationalist and localist views on the other new aligning issue, is being expressed in a relatively moderate form. This is different from what's happening in, say, France, where that position in politics is being articulated in a much more extreme and radical form by Marine Le Pen, or the form which it's taken in countries like Germany, where it's the AfD, or Spain, where it's Vox, and again, much more extreme articulation of those views. Our electoral system doesn't allow you to go the full sort of Le Pen route, because you wouldn't win a majority of seats that way. The other side of politics, though, the cosmopolitan liberal side, has not yet come together. And I think actually on the other side, you can see in every country two quite distinct blocks of opinion and voters, one of which is you could call the kind of thing that Dave described, slightly left, free market economics, egalitarian, strongly globalist, strongly internationalist, strongly supportive of a rules-based international order. But there's also a much more radical variant of it, radically green and committed to an extremely strong version of subjective identity politics and intersectionality. And one of the challenges facing people who want a non-conservative government is that there's that big division on the other side. And I finally conclude by saying that I think this new alignment, like all alignments before it, reflects profound social divisions in society. It does reflect basic conflicts of interest, outlook and experience that divide society, and it's the way in which those divisions are worked out. And the really big division is the one that David mentioned, which I would highlight, which is the division between those who have succeeded in the meritocratic labour market and those who are on the rough end of it. And I just sort of say, putting my own cards on the table here, personally, I think that meritocracy is one of the worst ideas ever, and even worse practice in many ways. So I think Michael Young, who of course coined the phrase as a pejorative one, must be turning in his grave at the way it's now become a term of approval. But I do think that that is the sort of big social division that ultimately drives a lot of this. So at that point, we'll turn over to the Q&A. And we've got several sort of questions here. Nicholas Budgeon has a question. To what extent do the panelists think the move away from the Labour Party and the Red Wall was solely driven by the party's weakness on Brexit? Or do the panelists think it was driven by more long-term factors, such as voters' increasingly aspirational outlook? So Lisi, I'll come to you first. What do you think the answer to that is?
Look, I think that if you're running a campaign, there's always two things that you have to bear in mind. Number one, you have to positively define yourself in voters' minds and provide a really compelling sell that's personally relevant to the majority of the population that you want to reach. And on the other hand, you've got to differentiate yourself from your opposition, and let voters know why you're the better choice. And so when it comes to voters moving away from Labour and the Red Wall, I think that part of it is to be blamed by the party's indecision on Brexit, but I really think that that's only half the story. These voters also struggled with Corbyn for as long as he was there. And it was fascinating coming off of the 2015 general election where there was this really heavy focus on long-term economic plan, to hear these Labour voters saying, well, hang on, everything sounds great in this manifesto. Free tuition sounds great. Free childcare sounds great, but where's the money coming from? How are we going to pay for this? And on the other hand, I think that Boris and the Conservatives did a really, really good job of selling themselves in a way that was enticing for these voters. So my answer in short is that it wasn't just Brexit that caused the shift in the Red Wall. There were some other factors too going on the other side of the aisle that made the Conservatives slightly more palatable in 2019 than they ever had been.
David, what do you think to that? You're muted, David.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you yourself said, Steve, I mean, Brexit was a kind of a symptom. It was emblematic of a shift that's been going on really for several decades, both here and in continental Europe, which is, I mean, to put it somewhat simplistically, the kind of liberal graduate class takeover of the main party of the left, and it, you know, if you look at activists, MPs, you know, cabinet ministers, they will all have had a relatively similar background. They will all have a relatively similar set of beliefs. So, I mean, essentially the anywhere worldview. There are many good things about the anywhere worldview, and many of those things are shared by much of the rest of the population too. But the graduate liberal class has a particular set of interests in things, and many of them are not shared by the rest of the population. I mean, the dramatic expansion of higher education, for example, and the collapse of more traditional vocational and technical education over the last 30 years or so, the great focus on cultural issues of the left, as it were, the various sort of gender equality, sexuality equality, race equality, you know, the new issue of transgender equality and so on. You know, you just have to listen to Radio 4 to get a sense of the priorities of this group of people. Almost whenever I turn on Radio 4, there seems to be some debate about transgender rights. You know, we're talking about a group of a few tens of thousands of people in the country. And of course, there's the immigration issue, which again is sort of maybe not in itself so central, but it's kind of emblematic of a group of people who are quite happy to put more universal rights ahead of the rights associated with national citizenship. And I mean, so you know, all of these things have been emerging over recent decades, and parties of the left have been doing the splits really between representing this new dominant group and trying to hang on to their more traditional voters. And some countries have done it better than others. I mean, Labour has actually been sustained artificially, you might say, by the first past the post system. I mean, Labour would probably already have gone the way of the Dutch Labour Party or the French Socialist Party if we had a proportional representation system. I mean, I think just final point. The other thing that I think in a way that Boris doesn't get sufficient credit for, although obviously the first past the post system supports him in this, is the way he's been able to, and the Tory party's been able to channel the forces of populism in a kind of mainstream, essentially liberal democratic direction, which hasn't always been the case in continental Europe. Not so much because, you know, the Europeans are less decent people than us, but it's a function of the of the PR system there that gives a voice to the more extreme populist element.
Yeah. Kate, what's your take on that? And you know, feel free to draw parallels with the United States.
Well, I actually think it's somewhat difficult to, because of course in the local elections here, the red wall, now the blue wall, doubled down on its decision in America the last time they had an election. The Rust Belt and the rest threw out the surprise candidate that they chose in 2016. I mean, there are some comparisons, but I agree with the panel that you can't simply say it was Brexit. I mean, first of all, I'm not so much sure that the decisions made in 2019 were about Brexit as they were about respecting the result of a referendum, which is a much bigger, much broader, more principled point. Obviously connected, but a bigger statement to make. And I don't think you can separate the results that we saw in the locals from what's happened over the past year and with the vaccine rollout. I mean, we saw every government be rewarded for getting jabs into arms. We saw the Labour government in Wales, the SNP in Scotland, Boris Johnson in England. So I think there's a lot going on there. I completely agree with you, Steve, and also David, that this is about values as well, and that people have gotten very tired of being told what to do all the time, and being told that often because they might hold a certain belief that makes them a very bad person, especially when they're not coming at it from a sinister point of view, but simply a different point of view. I think within the Labour Party, there has been this sense that if you're not with us, you're against us, and an attempt to not understand where some of their voters are coming from, but mischaracterize them often. And they have been paying a very heavy price for that. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things over the next few years is going to be to watch which way the Labour Party goes, because across Europe, you're seeing a revival of a green movement. If we look at countries like Germany, I mean, the German Greens have been making waves. And so the Green Party in the UK seems still quite far off that, but just how quickly these things could change. And, you know, it's not about Labour challenging the right at the moment. It's could anybody from the left challenge Labour because they're in such a weak position.
Yeah, indeed. And I will just ask one more question, but if you could all be very quick in your replies now. And this is rather to that point. It says, have the Conservatives become the English SNP, the SNP the new Labour Party, the Labour Party the dying Liberal Party, an allusion to the 1920s, and the Liberal Democrats a twitching corpse? David, what do you see of that? If you could be quick. Sorry, again, you're muted.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a witty way of putting it, and there is some truth in it. I mean, I think the extent to which the Tory party represents a sort of long suppressed English identity and indeed English priorities is partly true. It's certainly making it very difficult for some other parts of the United Kingdom. I mean, Northern Ireland, obviously, over the protocol. Scotland, the sense. Well, I mean, the problem is nobody has been used to an Englishness, even claiming what one might regard as its kind of legitimate interests, and because it's so much bigger than the other elements in the union, even claiming what are kind of quite modest and legitimate interests, you know, like respecting the Brexit vote, come to be seen as, you know, the big elephant in the bed, sort of squashing all the little elephants, which it sort of is. You know, it sort of unavoidably is.
Thank you. Sorry, I must cut you off. Otherwise, we're going to run out of time. Thanks a lot, Lisi. What do you take on that rather witty description, as David put it?
Yeah, gosh, I honestly don't even know where to start. You know, one thing that we say in research is that polls are just snapshots in time, right? They're not a prediction of what's going to happen in the future. They are just a sliver in time of what voters think at a particular moment. And so in that way, I don't really see it as Conservatives turning into, you know, SNP and you know, whatnot going on. It's the same parties. Sometimes they offer slightly different things, and sometimes it resonates with different people, and that's what we're seeing now. And I think that is the best answer I can give to the question. It's a good one, though.
Kate, quick answer from you there.
If I followed it right, I don't think the SNP was compared to anyone new, which might suggest that the author of the question thought that the SNP was going to go its own way. I think that's the outstanding question. When the pandemic hopefully is not at crisis level anymore in the very near future, thanks to the vaccine rollout, we can only hope. The main big question is not really going to be what happens to Labour, although I think it will be fascinating, or even what happens to Boris Johnson as a leader. It's going to be whether or not the union can be held together. And I think that if that question will determine everything that the author of that question is asking, because if Scotland goes its own way, we are in completely new territory. And if it doesn't, then you could see right-wing parties in the UK being more challenged by a coalition of left-wingers in England and the SNP in Scotland. But to me, that is the big question. We know what Nicola Sturgeon would like to do. We know Boris Johnson doesn't want to give her the opportunity to do it. But when we go back to normal political discourse, the pressure is on.
Yeah, I agree completely with that, by the way. If Scotland does become independent, that basically means the end of the British identity that was put together in the 1880s. I would very quickly finally add that I think the parallel that question draws between the Labour Party and the Liberal Party in the 1920s is actually very much on point. It's dangerous to assume that the Lindy effect works and that just because a party's been around for 100 years, it's going to be around for another 100 years, because the Liberals found out that was not true in the 1920s when they were not able to address the conflicts within their voting coalition in the aftermath of the Great War. And the Labour Party, with, I have to say, quite a bit of help from the Tory Party at the time, was able to replace them. So anyway, I hope the audience found this interesting conversation. Thanks very much to all three of my co-panelists for their contributions.